Byline audio.
Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name is Adrian Goldberg, and this time, the French elections and the rise of the far right. President Emmanuel Macron tried to outflank his opponents by calling a snap general election after a poor showing by his party in the EU elections. It backfired. After the first round of voting in the parliamentary poll, the clear winner with 33% of the votes was Marine Le Pen's RN party. They are the successor to the Front Nationale, created by Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine's dad, who famously declared that the Holocaust was, and I quote, a detail of history. The RN were hoping to install their candidate, Jordan Bardella, as Prime Minister. But ahead of the second round of voting, more than 200 opposition candidates have quit, allowing for the possibility, anyway, of an anti-RN coalition. Will that be enough to keep the right-wing party out of office? And how did it get this far? Assa Samake Roman is a French journalist based in Edinburgh. Olly Haynes is a freelance specialising in France who has written for Byline Times about how the French media have boosted the far right. Assa, let me start with you. Given France's history in World War II, the shameful collaboration of the Vichy regime with the Nazis, how did we get to a stage where the far right, or the hard right, as they are sometimes called these days, are potentially in a position to win power?
Good afternoon, Adrian. And first of all, I want to start by saying I'm going to be calling them the far right, because this is what they are. A lot of people are trying to adapt the terminology, call them the ultra right, the nationalist right. It's the far right. So how did we get there? They used to be called the National Front. Now they're the National Rally. They're not a young party. They've been having electoral gains since the 1980s, but it's true that now it's historic because they're so close to gaining power through votes, through democracy, which is unprecedented in France. I would say, and I speak also from the point of view of someone who comes from the rural parts of France, I come from the center, an area where we've seen public services being decimated, where people feel that the quality of life is really declining. And ever since the 2008-2009 crisis, where we saw a lot of unemployment, we saw a lot of shops closing, we saw the city centers, the town centers suffering. We were really able to see the rise of the far right. This rise is because people feel that the Paris elites, the government, is forgetting about them, but we can't also escape the fact that there's racism that is attached to that vote. So the National Rally, they've managed to capitalize on the feeling that people feel they're forgotten, people feel they are despised, people feel that they are invisible, but they've attached a little bit of hate on that as well. So they say it's the fault of immigrants, it's the fault of minorities, it's the fault of people who are unduly benefiting from the welfare state. And they're saying to people, if you want to be safe in your lives, again, we've got to get rid of what we think is a detriment to the country. So anyone who is not 100% French, anyone who's not born in France, anyone who has dual citizenship, etc., etc. So the project of the far right really is to divide the French people, finds very convenient scapegoats. But really, when you look at their program, you look at their economic program, everything means disaster for the vast majority of French people.
Marine Le Pen has attempted to move the party away from her father's legacy, hasn't she? I mentioned that she changed the name from the National Front to the Rassemblement National, the RN, which is what it's now called, and she's attempted to distance itself from those Nazi connections. Although I do notice that in the last 24 hours as we record this, an RN candidate has been forced to stand down after being photographed wearing a swastika. It's incredible. So is it exaggeration to say that they're a Nazi party? I mean, they don't have that kind of program, do they? They are, I guess, parallel with something like the right wing of the Conservative Party in the UK, the Reform Party. Would that be a kind of fairer parallel?
The Rassemblement National, National Rally, have done a very good job trying to normalize themselves. Now, a majority of people in France think they're just like another political party. They don't really see the danger with the National Rally. You will not hear the senior leadership of the National Rally say anything overtly anti-Semitic, overtly racist, overtly homophobic. They have really transformed themselves to show themselves as if they were the great defenders of the Republic, which of course is a fallacy. If you know even a little bit of French history, you will know that everything that they propose is absolutely against the principles of the Republic. The Republic is about basically anybody can become French. You don't need to be born in France. You don't need to have like French genes. Basically, it's a community of values. It's a political community. It's not an ethnic community, France. This is what the country is about. This is the values of the revolution since the 18th century. The National Rally is absolutely against that. But the thing is, you don't need to have the far right in power to have their ideas and their measures in power. If you look at the immigration and asylum law that was voted in December 2023, so just a few months ago, by the current president, Emmanuel Macron, and his government, the far right voted with them and said that that law was an ideological victory. The problem is a lot of their measures basically being super hardline against asylum seekers, against immigrants, against poor people. These laws have found their ways in mainstream French politics ever since the early noughties, especially under Nicolas Sarkozy. This is where everything really started. And then left-wing governments as well have started to implement these far-right policies and really adopted them. So more and more, they appear to be just normal. So this is the environment we have to operate in, where these ideas now are just seen as very normal, because it's just now the basis of the political conversation in France.
Yeah, I think the phrase is the Overton window, isn't it? You move the frame of what is acceptable and normal discussion. And if you move that to the right, then even people who are construed to be left-wing debate on those terms, and people can draw their own parallels with the United Kingdom, with what is going on in France. I mentioned the Vichy regime. I mean, that's perhaps a reference for older listeners, but as I understand it, some of the appeal anyway of the RN has been to older voters. So is it the case that the idea of collaboration with the Nazis is just seen as belonging to another century, that it's a ridiculous comparison? How does that play into this? Because for many years, I would suggest ordinary French voters would have been repelled by the idea of voting for a party that was seen as in any way tainted with that far-right connection.
I feel that for a lot of younger voters, I don't really know if it makes much sense to make the comparison with Vichy, because it was in the 1940s. A lot of people want to say, oh, this is just the past, you know, the National Rally, they've changed. After all, they got rid of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who created this party with people who were Waffen-SS sympathizers, colonization sympathizers. It feels to a lot of people that it is in the past, but this is like really the original matrix of the far right. When you look at all their symbols, the flame, this is the symbol from the 1970s when they were created. So I think it's really relevant to say where they come from. We should never forget where they come from. But unfortunately, for a lot of people, it just doesn't really make any sense. But, you know, they can try to whitewash everything, but every stone you turn with the National Rally, and it's the same with reform in the UK, every stone you turn, you will find a candidate saying that, you know, Hitler didn't kill enough Jews. You will find a candidate posting themselves with a cap with a swastika on it. You will find candidates liking pages glorifying the 1940s under Maréchal Pétain. You will find these people. So I find it very interesting when you have some voters or even some candidates, like in the UK, for example, who say, oh my gosh, I'm so shocked. I actually discovered that a lot of candidates standing for election under Reform, under Rassemblement National, are actually vile racists. It just testifies on the incredible kind of rebranding campaign these parties have gone on over the past few years. And I would say also aided by parts of the media.
And Olly, that's where you come in. You've written for Byline about how parts of the French media, anyway, far from holding the RN to account, have actually amplified their voices and given them tacit, maybe even sometimes not even tacit support.
Just quickly on the Vichy question, I've been speaking to young people who vote for the far right, who are militants for the far right, rather, recently. They regard it as people in other parties who collaborated, is what they say, and it's a regrettable part of their history, but we've moved on. But there's also been this sort of concerted attempt to rehabilitate parts of the Vichy regime in the sort of eyes of the French Republic over the last few years. Macron called Maréchal Pétain a great soldier. Éric Zemmour, who is a far-right politician, he was a journalist on the ostensibly centre-right newspaper Le Figaro, repeatedly whitewashed the Vichy regime, claimed they weren't anti-Semitic, and then got into a huge argument with the great historian of fascism, Robert Paxton, over his interpretation of Paxton's work. So there has also been this current of attempting to rehabilitate Vichy. But what we've also seen over the last few years is the consolidation of the French media in the hands of a few oligarchs, essentially, who have gone on a journey from the kind of centre-right, what you'd expect, to quite radical positions, often informed by sort of political Catholicism. One of these is Vincent Bolloré, who owns CNews, which is one of the biggest news channels in France. He owns several other news channels as well. And it is non-stop propaganda. Some stuff that comes out on there is sort of more deranged than what you might see on Fox, honestly. There was an article recently in the Nouvel Observateur that said that Bolloré supported Zemmour in 2022, and he did this as a kind of dry run, and he's refined the process of how he boosted the far right since then, and that when Macron called the dissolution of parliament, he effectively overtly opened his studios and his resources to the RM for their campaign. Several journalists from CNews are RM candidates. So there is a concerted effort on the part of the Bolloré media. And there are other oligarchs doing this as well. And they're all trying to push it in this really, really right-wing direction.
How significant are they, though? Bolloré, in your article, you describe him as the French Rupert Murdoch, but does he have the reach of a Murdoch? Does he have the Sun equivalence in France, or are we talking about GB News?
It's in between them, I would say. So he doesn't own a paper that's as popular as The Sun, though he does now own quite a respectable newspaper, the Journal du Dimanche, which is like a sort of business paper. And he appointed a very, very radical right editor of that, Geoffroy Lejeune. But the effect of Bolloré is more what he does to the rest of the media. Because by infusing the political and media landscape with these talking points about Islamo-leftism, about the Great Replacement, about destruction of French identity, he makes it a lot harder to conduct politics because people are having to combat that, zoom in on that, and then talk about these ideas and these frames of understanding politics. And it's a lot harder to talk about things like the cost of living, the environment, all of this, when basically the three I's, as Eric Zemmour calls them, immigration, identity, and Islam, are all that you're really allowed to talk about because it's what the Bolloré channels are pumping out day after day after day.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting and very relevant. Basically, every time you go and buy your card games or you buy your cigarettes at the local PMU, you will have a TV set, and the chances are the channel that is going to be on the TV set is CNews. So CNews is a 24/7 news channel, but you will have political commentators on it, and they all say the same things: how the country is really falling apart because of immigration, because of Islam, but because of wokeism, insecurity. In this election campaign, a lot of journalists have been doing vox pops, asking people why they vote for the far right, what they vote for the Front Nationale, and these people say, well, with everything we see on the telly, they're not really affected themselves by insecurity. They don't really have that in their small towns or in villages, but they see this 24/7 on television. So it feels like it's what's happening in the vast majority of the country. So in this campaign, what I found was absolutely necessary is a lot of political journalists starting to wonder, why are we doing our job, how we are doing that job, and how this is influencing democracy and the decision process in the country. And this is definitely needed because political journalism has a massive responsibility.
Olly, is your sense that the coalition against the RN will be successful? Clearly, there has been a shock to France as a result of that first round of voting. The centre and centre-left parties have come together to try and frustrate the RN. Will they be successful?
It depends what you mean by successful. I think in the short term, it's likely that they may deprive the RN of an absolute majority, though the RN will probably be the largest party in the parliament. So in that sense, yes, they will be. In terms of the more medium and long-term success of the RN, I think it's obviously hard to say over distance, but I think probably not. The RN has established themselves fully now as a normal party within the Republic. Eric Ciotti, the leader of Les Républicains, which is the sort of standard Gaullist right-wing party, which have been struggling for a while because they've been squeezed to their left by Macron and to their right by the RN, and they've not really been able to find an identity. They were the sort of furthest right edge that you could go, really, in the French Republic, and they have now aligned themselves with the Rassemblement National. This has done wonders for the RN in making them normalize because there is now an alliance of the right. Equally, Jordan Bardella has appeared with Eric Ciotti at business conferences, and the RN, as being reported in lots of business newspapers, lobbyists are flocking to them because they're looking like a potential next government. So business is looking to make sure that they can have their interests represented by the RN, all of which helps normalize the party. We also have the sort of whims of Emmanuel Macron. Apparently, he is toying with the idea of letting them in. The Macron camp is tearing itself apart. There's a part of the Macron coalition that think giving the RN a little bit of power now will prevent them from having lots of power later. So in the event that they do better than expected, it may look like Macron might just roll over and sort of allow them in the hope that showing them up as incompetent crooks dissuades the French people from voting for them in 2027. Equally, in the left coalition, it's very, very fractious. It's not particularly coherent. The coalition spans people like Aurélien Rousseau, who was a Macronist MP who resigned after the immigration law that Assa spoke about. And it spans to a party to the left of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the new anti-capitalist party. This is not a coalition that can hold together for very long. It is being held together by the kind of gravitational pressure of demands from unions, demands from the youth, and the historical weight of the situation needing to keep out the far right. But once the immediate pressure of the elections has dropped, I suspect these parties will go back to infighting. They've barely been able to stop infighting throughout this campaign.
Yeah, so it's a coalition of convenience, but one that is likely to break apart very quickly. You know, Assa, objectively, France has one of the highest standards of living in the world. It has working conditions that people in the UK would envy, limits on the number of hours that can be worked every week that are, as I understand it, quite strictly enforced. A pension age, even though retirement age has gone upwards in France under Macron, it is still a pension age which is younger than in the UK. And yet there has been, it seems to me, for a number of years, been a level of discontent in France. Macron himself was a representative of discontent with the establishment when he surged through to become president. We saw the Gilets jaunes on the streets of France just a few years ago as well, with a kind of not particularly coherent set of objections to modern life, but with a deep discontent with how things are. So the RN are clearly pushing an open door. There are a lot of people who are very unhappy with life in France, even though from the outside, you might look at it and say, well, what is there to be unhappy about?
I think it's because people have a feeling that is not totally unjustified that their advantages are being taken away. They're being eaten away. For example, in my hometown, so it's called Issoudun in the center of France, about 12,000 people. Until a few weeks ago, they had to close the A&E service. It just couldn't work 24/7 just because it was understaffed and the hospital was struggling massively. Over the past 20 years, we have lost our surgery service, we've lost our maternity service at the hospital, we lost the police station, we lost numerous trains to go to Paris or to go to Limoges. My mom has to drive 90 minutes to see a dentist. Like healthcare is becoming more difficult. The people who live there are seeing their children struggling to access housing. It's so difficult to rent in cities now. So you see a lot of people going back to their parents, you know, they are 25, 30, 35. They should be able to at least aspire to have their own home, but they can't anymore. This is what people are seeing. They're seeing that this whole really neoliberal system, really, to say the terms, is ruining their lives. And they're saying that politics is not really doing anything about it. Neither left-wing governments, like François Hollande's government, a lot of people were very, very unhappy about him. We're hoping that if the socialists got in power, they would at least try to really stop a little bit of that, but it's not really happened. But right-wing governments are not doing this either. They are raising the pension age. They are making healthcare more expensive. They are closing, classes, so there are more and more children in one class at school. They're just seeing the quality of life declining. So people are very dissatisfied. But I think one thing that the French have, but maybe people in Britain don't have, is that we go in the streets and we protest about it. We think that it's normal to have healthcare. It's normal to have functioning schools. We demand better from our governments.
Yeah, there is a kind of an innate bolshiness to French culture, which may or may not date to the revolution of 1789, but certainly that's something that we observe on this side of La Manche, isn't it? The French are willing to stand up and fight for their rights.
I mean, I've covered French protests a lot, and that's the sense that I get. Even when they feel that a particular battle is probably a losing one, like the retirement age, they're going to make it as hard as possible for the government to pass the reform. Because I think there's an understanding a lot of the time that any given policy that they don't like is the thin end of the wedge, and that if you resist it, it slows down the process of privatization, financialization, the sort of déclassement of people. Another thing is democracy. French people, not everyone, but I've met a lot of French people who talk about democracy in a way that I've not really encountered in the UK. I lived in Troyes, Gilets Jaunes. Troyes is a small town in the Champagne region. And people were sort of obsessed by democracy in a good way, although it didn't always express itself particularly coherently. But they would be talking about the fact that they voted against the Lisbon Treaty and that had got overturned. And then now there are articles in the French constitution that allows the president to steamroll parliament and things like this. And they felt like politics was about the representation of elite interests rather than the interests of the people. And they did sort of speak in these populist terms about the people, about democracy, and about the elites. That's not everyone for sure, but that's definitely something I don't encounter as much in the UK living here.
Assa, will the coalition work in the short term to keep the RN out of power?
I think the Republican front, so the legislative candidates who decided to step aside to prevent the election of national rally candidates, I'm terrible at pronostics, but I want to believe that it's going to work. I want to believe that the RN will not get an absolute majority, will not be able to do whatever the hell they like, basically. But for me, the question is what happens on the 8th of July after the election. We know it's going to be a disaster. The RN is going to have unprecedented numbers of MPs. This is going to steer the public debate in a certain direction. I think we're going to have a very difficult year in France because now there's been a dissolution. The president can't dissolve the National Assembly for at least a year. So I think it's going to be a very, very difficult year. For me, the question is how we rebuild from here, especially for the left, because a lot of their gains, if you look at people who are elected from the very first round, who had like a really easy election, they're basically all in big cities. What I'm really worried about is how the left speaks to the whole of France, not just the big cities, not just the suburbs, not just the people who have master's degrees and who are upper middle class, etc. How do we speak to teachers, to nurses, to people who are unemployed, to young people? They've not really featured in this election, I feel. How do we speak to the whole of the country? And we need to talk about culture. We need to talk about the media. We need to talk about education. We need to talk about our representation. There is so much to rebuild on. And also, our next big elections in France are going to be 2027. So in less than 3 years' time, we're going to have the presidential election. And I think the disastrous scenario would be to have Rassemblement National majority this year in 2024. And then in 2027, Marine Le Pen walks away with the election. Because what the Rassemblement National is really clever with is that I don't think they're going to implement 100% of their racist policies straight away. They're going to want to be reassuring. They go step by step, making sure that people are quite indifferent, people are very disenfranchised. And then when they get the full force of the democratic power, this is where they're going to get serious. This is what I'm personally, as a minority, a Black woman from France, what I'm really, really worried about.
Assa and Olly, I'm sure we'll talk to you both again. This has been a great insight. Can I thank you so much for that? That's Assa Samake Roman and Olly Haynes as well. This has been the Byline podcast, produced in Birmingham by me, Adrian Goldberg, and Harvey White, brought to you by Byline Audio. And if you haven't found out what Byline Audio is yet, do head over to bylineaudio.com, where you can access some of our other great podcasts. We've got Utter Bollocks with John Mitchinson and Otto English, which is a great, funny, myth-busting podcast. We got some really deep thought with Bonnie Greer and Hardeep Matharu, and Adventures in Americana. You can listen to the podcast free, but you will also get additional content and an ad-free version of this podcast if you sign up for premium. So I'd recommend that you do that. Of course, head over to bylineaudio.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.